Now, what Sherlock's method serves to do, apart from amaze and astonish, is demonstrate the power of deductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning requires the use of general principles to make particular instances more comprehensible. It's in some respects the reverse logic of inductive reasoning. Now, one of the ways to try and explain that is using triangles. If you were using inductive logic, you would notice a shape with three sides, three corners that equal 180 degrees in terms of the internal angles, and you would therefore surmise that it is a triangle. That would be induction, using the specific aspects of it to create a general principle. A general principle, however, would be that a triangle would have those elements. Therefore, using deductive reasoning would mean saying, I need to find a triangle, therefore I'm looking for a shape with three sides and internal angles equaling 180 degrees. One goes from general to specific in deduction, and one goes from specific to general in induction. He can use general principles to make sense of particular instances. The idea that drunk people would have scuff marks on a charger means, therefore, Watson's brother is likely suffering from an alcohol addiction. Now, typically deduction operates of something called a syllogism. And a syllogism is just a very, very basic form of argument. It's understood to be two premises that are linked by a common concept or fact that lead to a new conclusion. Usually it takes the form of A is to B and B is to C, therefore A is to C. Now, of course, many of you will recall this from basic rules of logic in terms of philosophy, but for those of us not familiar with it, I'll give you a simple example. All birds are animals. A is to B. All animals eat food. B is to C. Therefore, all birds eat food. Because they link on premise B, A and C are therefore logically connected. This would be an argument that is considered valid. It has a logical flow that makes sense. Truth, however, is a different story, because I can make an argument valid without making it true. I could say that all penguins are robbers. All robbers are mathematicians. Therefore, all penguins are mathematicians. Logically, the flow makes sense, because the two premises link up, but that statement is far from true and utterly ridiculous. Unless, of course, Sherlock could tell us differently. But the point behind it is that truth matters just as much as logic. When it comes to deduction, we need evidence to corroborate it. That's precisely what Watson does. He serves as a gauge to tell Sherlock whether, in fact, he is correct or not. Now, deductive reasoning, according to the textbook at least, really takes on two forms. You get syllogisms that are categorical, which is the one we've just sort of understood. A is to B, B is to C, therefore A is to C. But you also get conditional syllogisms, if-then conditions. And that would be if A, then B. For example, a basic one would be, if I study, then I will pass. They are both valid and true. Yes, true. It means you do have to study for the exam. But one of the nice ways in which this is illustrated in the textbook is using the Wason 4-card problem. Essentially, in that task, people are shown a card with a letter and a number that corresponds on the back. They are then shown these a few times to practice. So, for example, let's just make it very simplistic. A would have the letter on one side of the card, and if you flip it over, you'll see 1 on the other side of the card. B would be 2, C would be 3. Now, they don't necessarily go in the correspondence the way that I did, but it's the same principle. They would then say to you, okay, I'm now going to show you a set of cards, and you have to tell me which option is correct. So for letter A, on the other side of this card, will we see a number 1 or a number 2? And you would select the option. That is a case of deduction. You know, there is a general principle that the first letter equals the first number and so on and so on. You would then be able to deduce or figure out, based on the general pattern, what the specific instances would be. If A, then 1. If B, then 2, etc. It is through using this top-down reasoning, general principles to specific instances, that you can make sense of almost any information. In considering that, it brings us to the end of our brief tour of human consciousness. I'd like us to consider for a moment what I'm hoping you will have learned about cognition, sort of in a nutshell, over the past couple of weeks. To begin with, my hope is that you've gained a richer appreciation of the history of thinking about thinking. After all, cognitive psychology was the very first branch of psychology ever founded, as early as 1868, with the inaugural works of Donders, later becoming the psychology-based theory of structuralism, headed by none other than Wilhelm Wundt, our field's progenitor. Cognitive psychology, whether it has been prominent, bogged down by behaviorism, or revitalized through psycholinguistics and computer technology, has always been, and likely always will be, at the forefront of our field, now more than ever, with the neurification, or the neuropsychological revolution, we are undergoing. At the same time, however, there is a difference between seeing and believing. Because, of course, one of the first things we would have recognized is that perception is not the same thing as sensation. What you see and what you perceive is different, because perception is about how you interpret information. My hope is that you will have learned that the windows through which we see the world are inevitably tinted by our experiences. What you sense will be different to what you perceive because of top-down processing. Our knowledge, our beliefs, and our assumptions shape what we can see and what we can't. So the truth is, without knowledge, we are indeed blind. At the same time, one's senses are only useful insofar as they are actually captured by attention and concentration, the gateway to our consciousness. And attention and concentration, far from being an early selection model, as Treisman argues, has less to do with physical characteristics of stimuli and more to do with meaning. What actually matters to us is what we will encode and eventually store in an invested consciousness, in memory. Memory, whether short-term, long-term, working memory, or basic, will always have to do with the fact that meaning decides what we will encode, what we will store, and what we will retrieve. My hope is that you've begun to learn that memory, far from being one singular construct, has so many different forms: episodic, semantic, procedural, prospective, retrospective. All of these taught us that our memory, which is likely at the core of everything for us, is shaped and molded by many different neural regions in many different ways. But the stories that we eventually tell ourselves are in fact the ones that decide what kind of ending we will have. We also looked at knowledge bases, known thoughts and unthought knowns, how we develop knowledge based on parallel distributed processing and semantic linkages, and how our knowledge base inevitably shapes the way we think about everything in our world. How silver tongues and broken brains taught us a little bit about how language forms, because language, of course, follows the same neural structures as knowledge. My hope is that you learned how aphasia can not only show us how language can help us understand things, but also can limit us. That by Wernicke's aphasia, not understanding speech, or Broca's aphasia, not being able to produce it, can be massive limitations in our lives. But also that likely trends suggest that one day we might in fact do away with language entirely and become a predominantly visual species. My hope is that we've also learned that problem solving more often than not hasn't got to do with understanding logic. It's got to do with making leaps over logic, as we would have learned through insight-oriented problems, through Gestalt psychology. That more often than not it's about reconstructing a problem to make it more intelligible, that allows us to eventually solve it. And finally, my hope is that you have a better understanding of reasoning and decision-making, the science of freedom. The truth is, reasoning, decision-making, and judgment all have to do with how we frame problems, what information we allow ourselves to perceive, and what we don't. And that if we fall prey to our own cognitive biases, such as confirmation bias, the representative heuristic, illusory correlations, and the variability heuristic, we might in fact trap ourselves in the way that we understand our world. Looking at the rich tapestry that we've had to weave in terms of understanding cognitive neuroscience as a whole and cognitive psychology in specific, if I had to try and boil it all down to one thing, if I had to say what the most important thing I hope you will have taken from all of this is, it can be boiled down into one simple phrase: the enigma of meaning. The truth is, all of these cognitive processes are linked by one golden thread. What we experience as meaningful in the world and in ourselves determines what we will pay attention to in our history, what we will see and believe, what we will choose to enter into our consciousness, what we will invest our memories in, how we will develop our knowledge base, what we will communicate about, how we will solve problems, and what we will make our choices on the basis of. Meaning, far from just being a topic that Viktor Frankl talks about, is everything when it comes to our cognitive systems. My hope is that you will take that understanding forward with you and choose to make everything that you do more meaningful because of it. And I have enjoyed my time with you, both inside the classroom and, of course, technologically, I suppose. My hope is that you all will have taken something from this. I wish you all very well for your exam and look forward to seeing you on that occasion. And in the meantime, I wish you the best with your preparation. Take care in your futures, and I look forward to meeting you down the road as colleagues someday. Thank you.